We don't need oil. We have all the oil we need for ourselves. It's one of the great assets that we have. We have double, more than double, what anybody else in terms of oil production. We're at more than double any other country. So we don't need it.
That, of course, is the President of the United States, Donald Trump, asserting that America has more than enough oil. Well, our guest today on Strait of Tel Aviv and Beyond doesn't quite agree with the president. I had the opportunity to speak with Michael Rothman almost 1 week ago. He is the founder and president of Cornerstone Analytics and a man who has been immersed professionally in analyzing the global oil markets for more than 40 years. And today he does that for the Strait of Tel Aviv and beyond. Mr. Rothman shared with the Strait of Tel Aviv proprietary material that illustrates his commentary, and with his permission, we show his work while he is speaking in order to assist the listener, viewer in understanding the content. As you will soon hear, Rothman is very careful in predicting. I'm a little less hesitant. I share my big picture thoughts at the end of this podcast, and I've also written down my predictions. I'll share them in the near future. But I will say this now. Things are about to get very heated in the Strait of Hormuz, Persian Gulf, and Kharg Island. And that is a very bold prediction. This podcast is unlike my usual offerings. It is more technical and industry specific. So it may not be your cup of tea. In case you do drop off, I'll share with you now the conclusions that Michael Rothman works towards. That's the punchline. But in between, there's a rich and important discussion. But here's what he says at the end.
So I'm pretty comfortable asserting that the supply loss is going to be pretty massive. I'm pretty comfortable asserting that the price effect, if we look at where oil prices are right now, they're not as high as they're going to get. I'm pretty comfortable asserting that this is ultimately going to get to a situation where prices get so high that it will actually do damage to the economy, whether it's a full-blown recession or some version of recession.
I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel. Let's do this. Saturday, March 21st. It's just after 3 p.m. in the afternoon in Israel, where I am, which makes it just after 9 a.m. in the morning in the East Coast of the United States, where you are. Michael Rothman, founder and president of Cornerstone Analytics. Thank you so much for making time for Strait of Tel Aviv and Beyond today.
Thank you.
And we, of course, are here to discuss what may or may not be going on in the world, specifically with respect to oil markets and supply. Tell us a bit about what you do, because before we really get into the details of what's going on in the Middle East at the moment and how that may ricochet around the world. You've been in this business for 42 years. You've been at every OPEC meeting, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Companies, since 1986. And just for those of our listeners who may be wondering, what is this OPEC thing? OPEC really is a cartel, and it's a cartel of countries that primarily are in the Arab world, dominated by the Arab world, but not exclusively. So, Michael Rothman, introduce us to the world that you've been inhabiting for over 40 years and give us some of your sort of top-line observations with respect to what goes on and what is understood and misunderstood.
So there's an old saying that your health affects everything you do and everybody you know, and the oil markets affect everything you know and everything that happens in the world. It's a critical commodity. As much as has been written over the last several years that oil demand is going away and the world is somehow going to move beyond it, that's really not the case. And the reality is what I am is a subject matter expert on the global energy markets. I started my career at Merrill Lynch. I was a chief energy strategist, the co-head of the global energy team. And again, for that kind of work, you're dealing with money managers who are looking at investments that are directly and indirectly or inversely affected by what happens to the oil market. So you have the oil companies, but then you have the airlines, let's say, on the other side, or consumer cyclicals. Cornerstone Analytics is a consultancy that basically specializes in what's called macro energy research. So we're not publishing anything on individual companies. We're publishing on global supply demand, refining, biofuels, et cetera, and the outlooks we're paid to forecast. So something like the current events happening in the Persian Gulf are very front and center to what we do. There's a lot of misreporting about what's going on. There's a lot of data that the average person's really not going to get exposed to. It's not covered in the casual press. So for our clients, this kind of work is very pressing. And it's not just what it's going to do in terms of energy equities, it's what it does to the whole broad market. So that's the short story. But I would tell you, for the purpose of what you wanted me to do this morning, I was going to go through some very big picture fundamentals about what's really happening in the world. What are the things you're not really hearing about? Why do they matter? And then what does it mean for oil prices? Because ultimately, what happens here will affect the price of oil, which then starts having domino effects across the global economy.
So, Michael, you just referred casually to the casual press. I won't name any names, but I know from previous conversations that what you call the casual press is what most people would consider to be the expert press, media that purports to really understand and give information to the market about what's going on, in this case, in the oil markets. And you made a comment yesterday when we spoke, talking about your experience at OPEC meetings over the years, and then going to the casual press and reading the coverage and thinking and saying to yourself, were they at the same meeting I was? If you can just kind of give us an overview, big picture, what's the deficiency that you note in the media that covers or purports to cover the energy market?
Well, it's not a knock, and it's going to sound like a knock, but the reality is the people who generally go to the OPEC meetings, you have 800 journalists there when the meetings are in person. The week before, they were writing about the auto show. The week before that, they were writing about Victoria's Secret's new offerings. The week before that, they were writing about something regarding ocean pollution. And they're not really specialists in the industry. They don't know the data. They don't do that kind of analysis. And the overlayer that you have found, and this is, again, just my own observations, it doesn't mean I'm right, just my own observation, is you'll come to the meeting, if you're from a particularly new organization, with your decision already made about what's going to happen and why it matters. So a lot of times, for instance, you'll be in front of the same minister who's giving a briefing, and it has a certain implication, and yet if you read about it, it's turned into something else. And yes, I have been at many meetings, a lot, where I was always amazed about how it was being written about in the press versus what really happened. And I could spend a lot of time doing that and a lot of different examples, and that's not necessarily going to be helpful to your listeners, but it's a difference between news being data centric and reporting the news because it's the way you want the news to be. And that's probably not an unfair way of characterizing it.
All right, so let's get into the swamp, so to speak. I'm in the Middle East, not far from me, the battle rages. And all of a sudden, the whole world knows two things. They know what the Strait of Hormuz is and where it is, and they know what Kharg Island is and where it is. So before we get into your presentation, if you wouldn't mind, just explain from your perspective why they are so important or not, and then let's dive into what you've prepared for this discussion today.
Okay, so very basically, if you look at the supply and demand of oil globally, you have a handful of countries that are very critical net exporters. The Middle East is the highest concentration of those countries, and the bulk of oil that's moved internationally flows through basically a 2-mile waterway. So you'll hear about the Straits of Hormuz, but where it matters for the oil markets is the shipping lane, which is only 2 miles wide. So while the straits may be 16 miles, give or take, wide, there's literally just a 2-mile wide passage for these tankers to get through. That's why everyone now knows what the Straits of Hormuz are. They heard about the Straits of Hormuz if they were alive, based in 1979, 1980, when we had the Iran Revolution, fall of the Shah, the start of the Iran-Iraq War, which was in the fall of 1980, etc. Hasn't really been focused on for a long time since, although, not to be a nerd, if you were doing this, you heard about it in 1984 when the tanker war started. This was a phase of the Iran-Iraq War. So it's a critical volume of oil. There really isn't the ability to get it from anywhere else. You don't have enough spare production capacity in the world to offset lost volumes that would go through this waterway. And because it has been impeded, because traffic has been brought to a trickle, it starts having implications for the physical availability of oil, which is why this is something that affects everything that you know about and everyone you know.
And Kharg Island?
Kharg Island is the principal export hub for Iran. Again, if you were doing this in the 1980s when the Iran-Iraq war was going on and I was using Exocet missiles to try to debilitate the island and its capabilities, other than that, you really haven't heard about it up until within the last week. But 90% of Iran's oil exports move through that facility. Those oil exports average about 2.65 to 2.75 million barrels a day. Most people watching this, unless they do oil, that number doesn't mean anything, but take my word for it, that's a pretty significant volume of oil to be impacted. And then there is a secondary factor, which is something I thought I would talk about when we go through some of the slides that I prepared for this morning. And it's what happens if Iran's oil exports are interrupted, because there is a knock-on effect about what it does to their reserves and their production capacity. And we can talk about what happened in 1978 when the oil worker strike happened and Iran's production, which was about 10% of the world's total at the time, 80% of it went away. And it took little more than 10 years to raise production up, and it never got back to its pre-shutdown levels. They lost production capacity, a significant volume of production capacity. So it's not just one thing here. There are effects that carry through past the initial issues.
Okay, Michael Rothman, take us through your presentation.
So I prepared a deck in anticipation of what I thought would be the main issues people would want to hear about, who are your audience. And we're going to start with the issue of the supply risk. Now, again, I know this is not an oil audience, so we're going to treat this pretty straightforward, try to keep jargon down to a minimum. But for the oil market, the issue at the get-go when the hostilities began was the concern about a loss of oil supply. And there's four basic risks that it breaks down into. One is tanker traffic, which has become the critical concern of late, but you worry about the ability to move ships through the waterway. Then you're worried about, if you do shut down tanker traffic, if the countries that produce oil from the region now have to start throttling back their output. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, typically there's a continuous cycle of production, processing, then transportation, then it gets loaded onto ships, and the ships make their way to refining centers, and that is basically a never-ending cycle. If I cannot load the oil I'm producing onto ships, what happens is you start filling up your domestic storage, which is pretty finite. And then at that point, you actually have to start shutting in production. So that becomes forfeited supply. In other words, if Saudi Arabia was producing 10.4 million barrels a day, and they have to go to zero for a period of time, which is, let's say, not the case, but if they had to, they can't make it up by going to 20 million barrels a day. So when you start shutting in production, that becomes lost supply of the market. Then you have to worry about Iran's production being disrupted, whether it's from attacks or unrest. And then, of course, you worry about production being affected from Iran kinetic action, meaning they strike out at various oil producing and or export infrastructure in the region. As things stand, all four of those are actually happening right now. So again, I know we're going to keep this very general, and this is probably data most people just aren't used to seeing, but that doesn't mean it won't be understandable. What you see on the left is how much oil, and that means not just crude, it's refined fuels, so oil products, was moving by country during February. And the key statistic there is that text block in the upper right of that chart, not quite 23 million barrels a day. So the casual press will report that 20 million barrels a day of oil moves through the Straits of Hormuz. It's actually more than that, but doesn't make it any less significant. 20 versus 23 is still an enormous volume of oil. It's irreplaceable, but it's about 23 million a day, which cannot be made up by anybody. And then if you look at what we call forfeited output, which is now production that we're estimating is being shut in because you are not able to load tankers and you have at this point filled up your domestic capacity. And you could see that these add up to roughly, I think it's like 17 million a day. I put a special bar in there. It's colored differently and it merits some attention, and that's liquefied natural gas that would normally be coming out of gutter. Say, why is that getting a special bar? Well, that plant produces the equivalent of about 1.7 million barrels a day of diesel fuel. So if you look at liquefied natural gas and how it's used, most of it's power generation. If you can't use that, you're going to use diesel. You may use another type of oil product called residual fuel. It doesn't really matter in this case. The reason that caught attention literally day one for the work that we publish and what's going out to various concerns is if you look at what happened in the initial 24 hours of the market behavior, I think the price of crude oil on day one went up $5 a barrel. The price of diesel fuel on day one went up by $15 a barrel. It was immediately viewed as something that was going to affect global diesel supply. So even though this was happening in the middle of the Middle East, I can promise you that the price of diesel fuel in Topeka, Kansas went up pretty sharply, that the world markets are all linked. So this is literally an assessment of oil supply that's basically being lost to the market. And that matters because it's going to affect price. So then you say, well, are there workarounds? And there's two countries that have the ability to try to move a portion of their oil not through the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia built a pipeline 45 years ago. It's called different things. We call it the East-West Pipeline. It can move about 5 million barrels a day. If you look at the analysis on your right, you'll see that their exports were basically about 9 million barrels a day. So it's not going to be able to handle all of that. After Abqaiq was attacked by drones in 2019, they were able to temporarily flow close to 7 million barrels a day through that line and through a much smaller pipeline that usually moves petroleum liquids. Actually, they're called natural gas liquids. We don't know if that was a sustainable level of throughput. We can assume it is for the sake of making the numbers less scary. But the pipe's rated for 5 million barrels a day. The other pipeline's rated for about 300,000 barrels a day, which means some portion of Saudi exports, and they are the largest oil exporter in the world, are not available to the market. And the Saudis, and the reason for the title of that particular chart is Saudi Arabia views itself as part of their national identity to be a reliable supplier of oil. And this is why they haven't publicly made any announcements about force majeure. I think it's coming, but it's a pretty significant loss of supply because no one has the ability to make it up. The other country is the United Arab Emirates. I'll never say it right, but it's the Habshan Fujari pipeline. It can move about 1.6 to 1.8 million a day, about half of their exports. It avoids shipping through the Gulf. That's it. That's the sum total of your workarounds from the Middle East. So the oil market is losing a significant volume of physical oil right now. Again, I'll get to why specifically does that matter, but anybody who's watching this has to sort of take my word for a second that it's a pretty significant development, extremely bullish for oil prices.
You referred to the kind of singular importance of Qatar's LNG facility and exports. Am I correct that the largest LNG processing plant in Qatar suffered a direct hit in recent days?
Yeah, that's Lafan. Yeah, absolutely. Processes the equivalent of 77 million metric tons a year of fuel, and
Okay.
it going out is it was a direct effect on the diesel market because, again, if you're not going to be able to burn natural gas, you're probably going to have to rely on diesel generators.
And was
So
it completely knocked out?
they turned it off. I don't know how much damage. I'll be very blunt with you. I don't know. I have not seen anything to suggest the extent of the damage.
Mhm.
But the fact that it was able to get hit with ordnance is why they had to shut it down at a minimum just for precautionary reasons. One thing you don't ever want to have is compressed natural gas go to vapor and then have something that can combust it. That becomes just a giant bomb. So whatever damage happened was almost secondary to the fact that they now had to shut the facility down.
Okay. Let's carry on. Thank you for that.
Nope, no problem. So now you're looking at this graph. You're like, what am I looking at here? Well, probably the most significant development that occurred this past week was a bombing raid that took out processing facilities which handled natural gas that come out of the South Pars field from Iran. That's a big mouthful. What does it mean? Why should you care? Well, it's a couple things. Most of Iran's production, 70% comes from that structure. That's number one. Number two is 90% of Iran's electric generation comes from burning natural gas. So you lost something like the equivalent of 60% of the country's natural gas, which will directly affect electric generation. And electricity affects everything, including oil production. You cannot run your oil production capacities without having electric generation. And you can't do a lot of other things. You can't run refineries. You can't do a lot of things. What most people missed and what was not really reported well when this happened was the issue of electric generation as it affects oil. And then there's a direct loss of a type of oil stream called natural gas liquids like propane, propylene, the pentane pluses, things that, again, your clients or your readers aren't going to necessarily care about, but it's oil supply. And it's a direct loss of about 900,000 barrels a day of this supply. So on top of everything else going on, now you're actually losing oil supply here, and then you have to worry about this knock-on effect of electric generation capacity being greatly reduced and it affecting its oil flows. And you say, well, why does that matter? We have other countries that are shutting in production in the Middle East. Well, Iran's oil reservoirs are actually different than what you have on the western side of the Persian Gulf. And I'll talk about this in a little detail. And what does it matter to you? So back in 1978, late in the year, I think it was November, there was an oil worker strike in Iran as the country was basically on the verge of removing the Shah and the Ayatollah coming to power, and the oil workers got involved. 80% of the country's production was shut in. Well, why does that matter? Well, if you look at that analysis in front of you, at the time, Iran was producing almost 10% of the world's oil.
Wow.
And when the production got shut in, if you then look at the next 15 years, and actually the entire history since then, you will see that they have never been able to get the production back over 4 million a day. And this is what happens when you disrupt output in reservoirs that are thick and low pressure. In the western side of the Persian Gulf, southern Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the UAE, the reservoirs are shallow and high pressure. That's the kind of a reservoir that's actually easier to produce from. It's easier to get to. It's less difficult in terms of the geologics and removing oil from it. I just probably made every geologist who might be watching this, roll their eyes, but that's the way of trying to think about it. Well, if you look at the history of OPEC and you go back to when they first had quotas in 1983, the one thing that will become very apparent is that Iran never actually participated in any OPEC production agreement ever. Why? Because if they reduce output, it becomes something of a Herculean task to then raise output. The reason this is linked to that previous slide is with PARs offline and the loss of natural gas production, the likely effect that it's going to have on electric generation, you are worried now about not just losing production, but permanent loss of capacity. And that's in an oil market that was already structurally tight. So that's the implication beyond just the near term that matters. Is it too early to really make that assessment? Yeah. We don't have any data even for March production rates. We won't see that. I'm looking at my calendar for like another 3 weeks. But the reality is PAR's going offline looks like it's going to have an effect on their output on top of everything else that's happening with regards to shipping. So you say, hey, I read in the paper and saw on the news that there's going to be this big emergency oil inventory release from the OECD countries. And that's true. It's the largest emergency sale ever offered. The headline number is 400 million. The real number is closer to 300 million. That's why I put the text in there. Like the pledge made by the UK kind of did a head shake because they don't have any emergency oil to release. So I don't know what pledging 14 million barrels was meant to do. It's kind of a bad joke. But if you compare the amount of oil that may come from this emergency inventory release, it's kind of an injection of supply. And you look at what's the forfeited supply, that 476 million barrel a day number, which when I ran the math, we assume that shipping out of the Persian Gulf, the oil that's traveling through the Straits of Hormuz, was only going to be impacted for 4 weeks, which is sort of heroic and stupid at the same time because there's nothing to suggest it will only be 4 weeks. But even with the largest ever of these emergency inventories, you're still going to have this giant loss of supply to the system. And yes, throwing deck chairs off the Titanic is kind of the appropriate way to describe it. The other thing, which again is probably a little overkill for most of the people who are watching your podcast, is that historically, every time you release emergency, prices go up. So the release is designed really to try to keep the price of oil down, but without exception, these releases see the price of oil rally through the release of this emergency stocks. 2022, of course, is the most recent example. So when Russia went into Ukraine in 2022, the OECD countries made what was then, not till this one, it was then the largest ever coordinated release of SPR stocks. That's the bigger chart on the right side. And without any actual loss of supply, without any real problems, no production events, etc., and you're dumping SPR crude in the market, the price of oil doubled. We went from around 70 to 140. So this idea of releasing SPR crude as a way of keeping gasoline and diesel prices down, etc., doesn't work. Hasn't been an example where it's actually been the case.
I want to just jump in with 2 points of quick clarification
Sure.
before we move on too much. You mentioned that in 1978, when the Iranian oil workers went on strike, just in the very chaotic pre-revolutionary phase in that country, up until that point, Iran had been supplying the world with approximately 10%.
Their production accounted for 10% of world oil supply.
Okay. What I was curious to ask was what percentage of the supply has Iran achieved since?
Currently, Iran's responsible for about 4% of world oil
Wow.
supply.
Okay. And the other question, Michael, if you don't mind, is
Well,
you're talking about this. I mean, it sounds somewhat performative, but this OECD release of reserves, I'm assuming it's to alleviate a shortage, right? Supply is low. And I'm a layperson in this world. So to me, I would think, okay, well, if you're putting more supply into the market, that will temper price increases. And you say the price just keeps going up and up and up. Is it modified the increase by the release of reserves?
so here's the thing. There's not a reductionism here is not quite going to work. I'll tell you why. In
Okay.
2022, the most recent situation, there was a report issued by the International Energy Agency basically stating that the world was going to shun 3 million barrels a day of Russian oil as a reaction to its invasion of Ukraine. That was the report. It didn't happen. When it was being written about at the time, we spent a lot of our own time writing about the fact that this was basically a false statement. Because if you looked at the global oil supply and demand system, the world could not shun Russian crude. There wasn't the ability of other countries to make up for that volume. Yet that story became the justification for what at the time was the largest ever release of emergency stocks. And the simple truth of the matter is that if you look at the global oil supply and demand system, it's structurally much tighter than people want to believe it to be. And for instance, in August of 1990, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the world overnight lost 4.2 million barrels a day of supply. Those were the net exports of those two countries. They went away. It was like the switch went off and the lights were out. The rest of OPEC was able to make up for that lost supply within 3 weeks. So there was never any physical hiccups in the oil market. Refiners kept getting all of the barrels they needed to turn them into the fuels we use. There was no disruption because there was plenty of spare capacity to make up for that lost oil. In 2022, if you look at all the countries that can produce oil in the world and you look at who has spare capacity, which is really ever just the OPEC countries, there was not enough oil in reserve, production and reserve, to make up for that 3 million barrels a day. The number was somewhere down by about half of that at the most. So the assertion that the world was just going to stop buying Russian oil was based on a lie. It was based on this view that there was all this extra spare capacity. Basically, not to deviate, but kind of what most people heard prior to or at the beginning of the Iran war, the current hostilities, that already oversupplied by this massive amount of oil, 4.5 million barrels a day, which was incorrect, that OPEC had roughly 4 to 4.5 million barrels a day of spare oil production capacity, also incorrect. The number was closer to 700 or 800,000 barrels a day. And that there was 1 billion extra barrels of oil floating on tankers in the ocean that could come to market any time. Also another falsehood. So this notion of releasing emergency stocks here is meant to temper currently what will likely be massive amounts of oil that are going to get lost to the system, what I call forfeited supply.
Okay.
When you run the math, it's not going to do that. It will temper it, but it actually will not offset it. That's number one. And number two, in terms of what most people care about, which is what they pay when they go to get gasoline, like I can cite the statistics for the US, I haven't done it for other countries, but the largest outlay for energy by US households is for gasoline. It's actually much bigger than electricity. Most people assume it's electricity, but outlays for gasoline are much bigger. So the price of gasoline at the pump is the most visible energy cost to consumers. We've seen price at the pump over the last couple of weeks go up more than $1 per gallon, which is a pretty dramatic change. It's actually the largest ever change in that period of time in the entire history of retail prices.
Okay.
So this idea of, why these graphs is to get to the point that the idea of this notion that you're going to release emergency stocks and that's going to keep the price of oil down, there's no data to back that up. It's just the opposite. Price of oil rallies through it. If you get to the why, and it's a little bit of a guess on my part, it's because when you're releasing emergency stocks, it's more of a signal that there's some kind of a bona fide crisis. And the normal pattern of behavior is to accumulate when you're worried about availability, which is very bullish for the price of whatever you're looking at, in this case, oil. So all the talk that I've basically engaged in so far, and again, it's a non-oil audience, but we're going to have to go a little bit lower than 10,000 feet so that this has some additional meaning for the people. There's about 170 countries in the world that consume oil. There's 83 countries in the world that produce oil. You have all kinds of factors that play at all different times, but ultimately everything nets down into inventories here held by the OECD countries. The OECD was basically the oil buyers club that was formed in the aftermath of the 1973 Arab oil embargo. And if you're looking at this and you say, wow, there's a really strong inverse pattern here, the answer is exactly. If the market is structurally tightening and inventories are dropping, the price of oil will go up and vice versa. All the things we were talking about, that forfeited supply and what was happening with shut-in production and Qatar's LNG being shut down and interrupted shipping, ultimately gets down to an inventory effect. What's going to happen to storage? And there was actually a very strong relationship between inventory levels and oil prices. So much so, 25 years ago, built a model called MICR, which is essentially an inventory oil price model. It's a proprietary model, but you can use it to create a price estimate based on what will happen to the physical oil balance. In other words, what kind of an inventory effect are we looking at? And then what does it actually do to the price of oil? Now, this table is clearly overkill for the podcast, but I figured it would be worth your watchers seeing this. And you're like, what are all these numbers and what do they mean? So the top 4 numbers there are estimated loss of flows out through the Straits of Hormuz right now. That's an estimate of interrupted shipping. It's not really a hard number because there's not great data currently to get a sense of just how much oil is still being restrained. There are indications that a couple ships are getting through. So it's not the full 23 million, it's 17. If you look at the first line, 4 weeks, that's kind of our base case. That's a scary enough set of numbers for most people. The 308 million number next to it is the offset, assuming that all of the SPR sales that can take place that were announced actually happen. So we're just assuming 308 million barrels is going to come out of emergency stocks and to offset this loss. When you start looking at that interrupted shipping going up just a couple of weeks at a time, you can see the net loss is getting massively big. And if you plug that inventory change into our model, that's the end of year oil price. Now, we were already out of consensus with our view, and I know this is not built around consensus, not consensus views, so it doesn't matter. But most people thought the price of oil was going to stay under 60, go lower, etc., which is completely opposite of the way we saw things. But that's secondary. If you look at that loss of supply being extended and what it does, no other effects, you start getting these, wicked high oil prices. Then, per one of your early questions about Kharg Island and the saber rattling coming out of the White House about visiting devastation on that facility, which I think is probably close to a zero probability. The last thing we sense that this U.S. administration wants is a rocketing high price of gasoline at the pump. I just don't see that as a realistic scenario. So I label it saber rattling. But let's just say I'm wrong. All right. I'm not an oracle. Let's just say I'm wrong. And you start looking at a loss of exports on top of just the 4-week interruption in shipping. In other words, there's an accretive loss of supply. So we're not looking at extended losses of shipping. We're just going with what we thought was the minimum 4 weeks. And then we start looking at losing Iranian exports. And again, the inventory effects start becoming quite massive, and you start getting very high oil prices, much higher oil prices than what people are really prepared to deal with. And, it will have implications for the economy. But from the point of view of what you asked me about explaining to people, why does all this matter and why should I care? And I start with the sort of the fact that oil affects everything and everybody in the economy. It's as much as people want to believe oil is going away, it's not.
That,
But if
yeah.
you're looking at what's happening right now, theatrics aside, the sense someone should be getting is this is way more serious than what I might have thought, and I understand why it's so much more serious than what I would have thought, because there's really not very well articulated discussions about, these volume impacts and what they do.
Right. That is fascinating, but I have some just kind of wrap up questions, if you don't
Sure.
mind, Michael. Kharg Island, there's a lot of information out there, and it's impossible to keep up, certainly from my end and where I live. Feels like we're drinking out of 200 fire hoses a day sometimes. But my understanding is actually that even if it's worse, this administration has not threatened to destroy Kharg. It has destroyed and attacked some of what they say are military reserves or operations on Kharg Island. But there is talk about US and perhaps other forces occupying Kharg Island. And the intention of that, my understanding is, would be to free up oil so that more could move through the Strait of Hormuz. But I mean, that's all I think outside of your bailiwick. It gets much more into military capability and strategy. And I will be turning to one of my regular pundits for that because there's a recognition that the Strait of Hormuz, that chokehold, has to be released. It has to be opened up. And I'm
So
thinking that what your clients, and if there are governments among them, what they're coming to and asking is exactly what I'm going to ask. So, what does it all mean, Michael? Where is this going? How do we plan our economies? What do
okay.
you tell them?
So a couple different things. The notion of occupying Kharg Island and somehow translating that into opening the Straits of Hormuz, you might have a better shot finding, a leprechaun or a unicorn or something like that. That's kind of fantasy level material. We've think versions of that story, I'll call it a story, since Saddam was deposed in 2003. And the notion is you remove Saddam as leader of Iraq, and we're going to get in there and we're going to raise Iraq's oil production to 8.5 million barrels a day. That was the chatter, and it never happened. And I kind of remember laughing when I was told that by someone very senior who I thought should have known better. Then you'll hear a version of that like Maduro's gone. We're going to go into Venezuela and we're going to liberate billions of barrels of oil. And again, guys like me who just say, okay, that's just really not correct. It's a multi-year process at best case. It assumes hydrocarbon laws are written. It assumes all kinds of other things would have to happen, et cetera. So Talk about taking over Kharg Island and then translating that into more supply is really problematic. The stories that were being purported early on in this was pointing to the fact that A, it was a low risk, B, it was something Iran would not be able to do because their military capabilities were going to be degraded so quickly, which clearly has not been the case. Their ability to attack neighboring countries who were supporting U.S.-Israeli actions was going to be limited because, again, their offensive capabilities were destroyed. And here we are 3 weeks later, and you're no closer to that than you were 3 weeks ago. Despite, I get briefings every day about different activities that are happening and what were supposed to be degraded capabilities, and then you still can't move ships through it, etc. So I'm not going to overplay it, but I think the notion of Kharg Island and its significance from our perspective and what probably most people that I deal with care about was, would it actually get destroyed? And the situation where that to happen is so unpalatable that I put it at a near zero risk. Now, hitting something that might be a military capacity on the island as opposed to something that affects oil exports, look, that's really not it's the issue of hitting pumping stations, tank farms themselves, or the ability to then pump oil onto ships, the berths that load the ships. Then we have a different story to worry about. So that's kind of one. Number two, in terms of how does this end? Because there's so much fluidity in the data, a lot of times, which I do because you have to say it's a guesstimate or an estimate because we don't really know hard data yet, and we're very focused on data when we do this kind of work. But the way it looks to me is this ends, and we've had our discussions with our clients already about what's the price of oil that kills demand, which means killing the economy. That is the question of the last week. That was probably the most prevalent. And we look at expenditures on oil as a percent of GDP, and you start getting into numbers that talk about average annual prices, not the day or a week, but the annual price that are ranging from basically $160 to $181 a barrel. That's the way you get to a certain percent of GDP. And at this stage, it's probably somewhere in the middling probability where you have to really worry about that, because this loss of supply looks like it will be massive. Demand is still actually chugging along. You look at indicators like global air traffic, and they are very robust. You say, why would that matter? Jet fuel demand is only a small percentage of total oil use, and that's true. It's like 7.5 or 8%. But in jet fuel demand and changes in air traffic are very highly correlated to total global oil demand. So in terms of real-time indicators, the world is still consuming at a very strong clip. So when you start losing supply and that bubble finally works its way through the system and inventories start coming down really sharply, the price impact is going to be pretty leveraged. And I doubt this is going to be over in a week. I doubt all this oil is going to be liberated quickly. There's going to be a very significant, really dramatic loss of physical supply to the market. That portends a lot of bullish pressure. And bullish pressures for oil is bad pressures for most other things.
And bullish pressure for oil means higher prices.
Correct.
And China also gets, if I'm not mistaken, the most of its oil supply from Iran.
Think they were Iran's largest customer. I think the number, and if I'm wrong, I'm sorry, I think it was about a fifth of their imports were coming from Iran.
Okay.
That's the math. So,
Well, and
the oil market's global, right? So
yeah,
people think, well, country A is worse off than country B, or like the U.S. is better off because it produces a lot of oil, et cetera. But here's the way it works. Oil flows where prices basically direct at the flow. So there's always an arbitrage, so to speak, taking place.
hmm
And when you have something like the price of crude rallying generally, gas prices go up everywhere generally. Doesn't matter one market or the other. That's kind of a false hope. In the current environment, China is the largest oil importer in the world of crude. They're the largest importer of crude in the world. You want to guess who the second largest importer of crude in the world is?
do and I don't, but I'm going to go crazy here.
Go ahead, go crazy. Who do you think it is?
It's either going to be, I'm going to say the U.S.
It is. U.S. is the second largest crude importer in the world. So you'll
Thank
hear
you.
things about energy dominance and energy independence, and those are based false versions of the data. The U.S. produces the largest producer, but much of the crude the U.S. produces really isn't suitable for U.S. refineries. So the U.S. is the
Interesting.
second largest crude importer, which is why when they think, well, the U.S. is better off, it's really, again, a false portrayal of the data.
So the US it is. And we're dealing with a lot of smoke and mirrors based on what you've told us, right? Because
Well,
we
again,
have
a
the
lot of
president saying that, oh, we got reserves like, for the next, forever. We're fine. We're energy independent. And what you're saying is it's not that simple, obviously.
other leaders in this country have been saying the U.S. is energy independent for years. Doesn't make any of the claims less false. The
Okay.
reality is, it is a global market. Losing this volume of supply has implications for everybody. And the way the market works is to do its job, it's going to try to ultimately ration supply, which means a much higher price.
So, Michael, I want to just kind of try to wrap up and, of course, put you in the position that you say you can't be in, which is to be somewhat oracular, to be my oracle for the day, and to try to summarize this very intense, interesting presentation and your sharing of knowledge. And it comes down to this: there are so many dynamic variables at play in the oil market, the global oil market, at the best of times. And this moment is not what I think anyone would consider the best of times from any perspective. And the conflict in the Middle East has its own kind of craziness. There have been so many things that have occurred that no one anticipated. And just, I think yesterday we learned that Iran, in fact, has missiles that have reached a much greater distance than anyone believed to be true, proving that, in fact, they can reach Europe. So we have the very dynamic oil market, which is global. We now have this very significant conflict in the area where much of the world's oil is produced and it's unable to come out. Do you feel comfortable projecting that all of this instability, which is, I'm going to say, clearly going to continue for some time now, will almost certainly result in oil shortages, higher prices, and economic impact globally that we simply can't predict, but we know will transpire?
So, predicting is a dangerous business, yet that's what we're paid to do. And you want to always avoid getting into discussions about what I call normative economics. This should be or that should be. We have to deal with what is. And
Right.
then you end up assigning probabilities to certain types of situations. So it is a virtual certainty that there's going to be, it's already happened, a loss of supply.
Right.
Then you start getting into scale. And I'm the first to admit that there's a lot more questions than data can give you an answer to at this stage because we just don't have the data as of yet. A lot of it is opaque, and countries don't want to admit to production shut-ins for a reason because it creates a doubt about their ability to be, quote, a reliable supplier. You have to live with that. But I am pretty comfortable asserting that the volume of oil that's going to be lost to the global system is massive. I've been doing this a pretty long time, and I've never encountered this sort of a supply shock. COVID and what we saw with demand was a demand shock. And OPEC and other countries actually reacted pretty quickly and ended up cutting back their production and offset those effects.
Mhm.
The problem in this case is when you start having these massive losses of supply, you're looking at your toolbox as to what can we do to really offset this lost supply. And the answer is not a whole lot. Not when you're talking about the scale of output being forfeited. And again, I know I've already said it, but I'm going to say it one more time. In the scenarios that I went through, which I'm sure were a little more technical than might be comfortable for someone who's just casually looking at this, we assumed only a fairly short period of time for interrupted shipping. Even that is a black swan. I mean, in
Yeah.
the analysis of the oil markets, and you talk about black swans, Abcake, when it got attacked in 2019, was a black swan. That wasn't even supposed to happen. The Straits of Hormuz being shut down, which you've heard about for 50 years, wasn't really supposed to happen, yet it did happen. And now you're dealing with the fallout of this oil that's being a loss of the market, creating kind of this bubble that's going to travel through the system, shut in production, which is another issue, then recovering from that. And then, of course, this past week, this loss of natural gas in Iran and what that's going to do to their electricity and then their oil production.
Hmm.
So I'm pretty comfortable asserting that the supply loss is going to be pretty massive. I'm pretty comfortable asserting that the price effect, if we look at where oil prices are right now, they're not as high as they're going to get. I'm pretty comfortable asserting that this is ultimately going to get to a situation where prices get so high that it will actually do damage to the economy, whether it's a full-blown recession or some version of recession.
And you said that your presumption as you make these predictions and look forward, your presumptions are based on the shipping lanes being interrupted or shut down for 4 weeks. And in fact, if it was longer, obviously the impact would be more severe.
Correct. Correct on both counts.
Thank you so much, Michael Rothman, for your time, for the slides you presented, and for taking us through this really important issue and market so that we can understand it a little more clearly than we did an hour ago. Really appreciate this.
Well, thank you.
And thank you all for listening. This has been an intense podcast, I'm sure, for many who are not accustomed to working through graphs and economic data, and you may want to review it in part or whole a second time. Thanks again to Michael Rothman for being so generous with his time and work. And please note, the proprietary slides shown on the screen may not be produced or used without the permission of Michael Rothman of Cornerstone Analytics. I'm recording this final bit on Thursday, March 26th, after a pretty intense week so far in Israel, and a pervasive and building sense that something big is coming in the war with Iran and in the Strait of Hormuz. I'm always careful when it comes to predictions because the odds of being correct in the Middle East are dreadful at best. But I will say this. Negotiations with Iran are a non-starter. Iran is an ideological, absolutist regime with everything to lose and nothing to gain by compromising. The regime in Iran does not care about the suffering of its own citizens. So taking on America is really appealing to this regime. And winning, beating America, even better. What's winning in their eyes? Standing, remaining, staying in power, carrying on to see the next day. Just as we saw with Hamas, there's a very different concept of victory that prevails in the mind of an Islamist. Furthermore, what we know is happening, and we're paying very careful attention to in this part of the world, is that significant military assets of the United States Marines are being moved to the Middle East, within striking distance of Iran. Israeli airspace is almost totally sealed. There are minimal civilian flights, and those are with Israel's flagship airline, El Al, only. Most flights for civilians have been canceled at least until mid-April, and there are other restrictions on air travel. This is unprecedented, as is so much about this time. And that, dear subscribers, is a wrap. Until next time, thanks for being here, and stay safe. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to vivian@stateoftelaviv.com. That's VIVIAN @stateoftelaviv.com. And if you go to our website, stateoftelaviv.com, you can find the subscribe button and take it from there. Hope that you do that. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Jan Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything. Thank you, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team, and thank you, listeners, for being here. Until next time, stay safe.